Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I am J. Warner Wallace. Now, we're going to cover a topic today that is pretty broad and pretty large. And it falls in our category of quick shot responses that we have been looking at related to objections that are offered against Christianity or against God's existence, whatever. These are conversation stoppers, typically, that your friends and family members will offer. And sometimes we find ourselves like going, well, how do I even respond to that? And I wanted to give you the briefest possible responses that you could offer. I've stacked all of these up on our website at coldcasechristianity.com. Go into the writing section and you'll see that I have a quick shot category in the writing section. Also, you'll see a tab there to download our phone app. When we first started, we didn't have enough of these to actually have its own writing section, but now we do. And so I've got them there for you. Remember, at the website, every page is downloadable as a PDF file. You can print it. It's designed to be printed without the headers and footers, without the sidebars, just the text of the article. Every page is there for that reason, because we wanted you to have free resources. But of course, we're moving toward digital platforms, and you might be out someplace, you're not going to have your collection of PDF files. You need to have it on an app, so you can just open up your phone while you take a break from the conversation, get the response you need, and get right back in the conversation. That's why we've staged these in the phone app. Okay. A couple weeks ago, we did a show in which we talked about the objection, there is no sin. And in that show, we talked about how the idea that there is no sin, that someone might level that objection, is really probably somebody who doesn't believe there's any God, because the connection between sin as a crime against divinity, a crime against God, is pretty tight. And so we wanted to move people toward the conversation about God's existence. But today, we're going to handle we're going to handle that objection. And here it is on your screen. The objection is simply that there's no evidence for God's existence. You might want it to be true. You might have some intuitive experience. But if you outside of your own experience even, there's really no other evidence for this. Well, I want us to be able to respond to that. I don't want, though, and this is what we often do as apologists, right, is we can undersell the value of your own experience as a piece of evidence. I get that. I do think that your experience has to be assembled in the larger cumulative case for God's existence or for Christianity's truth values, whatever its claims are. And I don't think we should underestimate the value of your experience. I think, as a matter of fact, it's critically important that we use that additional piece of evidence. But here's the problem. If all you had was one singular piece of evidence to make a claim, and it happens to be your experience, then all I have to do in order to overcome your single piece of evidence is knock down your experience. And I have an experience of my own. It's different than yours. Therefore, we're done. Trump, I've got my experience. You've got yours. No, I think we need to do a little more than that. And that's what I'm trying to do by offering responses outside of your own experience. So when someone offers this objection, well, you've got no real evidence for God's existence. Well, we need to be able to answer that quickly. And there's a couple different ways we could take that, we could approach that. And what I want to do today is give you three possible ways to respond. Now, I will say this. I think you're going to have to know something at a much better level. People ask me all the time, I'm just new to apologetics. I don't know how to make a case for God's existence or a case for the reliability of Scripture or a case for Christianity or for Jesus. And it seems like there's a lot of stuff I got to study, especially if you're somebody who believes you have to make a cumulative case. I need like 8, I got to master 8 pieces of evidence. No, I get it. I can see how that could be scary. It could be intimidating. You'll never get started if you think you have to go that deep in order to say anything. I think for a lot of us, and for me, as somebody who was looking at all the evidence, becoming a Christian, I then wanted to start to communicate the evidence. But I knew it's going to take me a while to climb that curve on evidence from the universe or evidence from biology. That's not my natural discipline. But I knew that as a cop, I could talk articulately, and I've thought a lot about the nature of the moral law. And so I just stayed in that category for a long time. And if somebody said, why do you think God exists? I would just stay in that one little narrow slice of evidence, because I felt like, number one, I was interested in that slice. Two, I had stories and observations and experiences that would actually help explain that slice. So I'm suggesting for you that if you can't master a large, broad range of evidence for God's existence, no problem. Find the one thing you think is easiest for you to master, the one thing that God has shaped you uniquely, that you're drawn to it. Maybe your profession gives you some insight into it, and stay there for a while. And if that evidence is good, by the way, that's sufficient. But I think there's a broader case, and I want to be able to offer. So I'm going to touch on all those things today, but I just want you to remember that you don't need to master everything in order to be effective at something. So let's get on it and let's answer it. We're going to give you 3 possible answers to this objection that there is no evidence for God. Here is the first one. As always, I will put it on the screen so you can track along. Here we go. Well, what do you mean by evidence? Right? I mean, what would count for you? You realize now there are 2 forms of evidence, right? I mean, this is the kind of evidence that is used in every criminal trial. It's used to prove anything. There's only 2 forms. 2 forms: direct evidence, and that happens to be simply eyewitness testimony. And there's indirect evidence, and that is everything else. Now, both those forms of evidence count. They're both used to make cases. They're both used to make cases in criminal law courts. There's a large body, I don't know if you knew this or not, of direct evidence for God's existence. Now, what I mean is, from a Christian perspective, we've got a large body of direct evidence, eyewitness testimony of people who actually observed the resurrection, recorded it, they are recorded in history. And, you know, we actually have another body of direct evidence, because there are people, you know, who will tell you that they have had experiences that they attribute to God's interaction. And you might discount those. You might want to try to explain those other ways. But you would have to at least admit that this is a form of evidence. And you should take it seriously if you say you are concerned about the evidence for God's existence. Now, beyond those 2 forms, though, of a kind of direct evidence, right? Testimony of people who saw Jesus, or testimony of people who now can tell you they've had experiences they attribute to God, there's a huge body of indirect evidence. Now, that's everything else you can discover by way of science. So, for example, we're in a universe that came into existence from nothing. The science tells us that. And anything that has a beginning, like a universe, has to have a beginner. And it turns out this beginner, according to the science, cannot be spatial, temporal, or material. So we have now an immaterial, non-temporal, non-spatial first cause of the universe. You're already stepping in my direction here. This is why we would call this evidence. We have fine-tuning we see in the universe. I mean, if you found something was fine-tuned, like a guitar, you would assume that there's a fine-tuner. We have the origin of life from inorganic matter, and it's all driven by information in DNA. How do we get information from anything other than intelligence? If there's a first beginner of the universe that's non-spatial, non-material, non-temporal, it appears also to be an intelligent mind because it accounts for DNA information. Really, I mean, that's a lot of indirect evidence. And most of that is best, I mean, I would say that body of evidence, that indirect evidence, is best explained by the existence of a divine creator. And again, I'm looking at both direct and indirect evidence. Do you think you might be interested in examining all the evidence, both the indirect and the direct evidence, with me that's related to God's existence? So what are we doing here? Well, we're trusting that, now look, your conversation might look slightly different, because you might be saying, well, look, I think there's great evidence for this just in the moral law. And that's the one thing you might have mastered. Okay, great. So now you're going to take some time to unpack that for them. So I think you could actually make headway with somebody if you don't have expertise, or you haven't read, or you haven't mastered, or you haven't even looked at all these other areas. Take the one area you have looked at and make sure they understand the categories, because they might think, well, this argument for God's existence from morality, that's not evidence. Oh, actually it is. These are inferences. They're indirect inferences, indirect evidence, and don't let them off the hook. Indirect evidence in a court of law is given the exact same weight as direct evidence. Don't let them say, well, that kind of evidence, though, is minor. I need hard evidence. Hard evidence, quote unquote, is not a category. It's direct or indirect. That's it. So don't let them say things like, oh, there's no hard evidence. There's no such thing as hard evidence for anything. That's not a term. You're making that up. You're watching too much TV. We want to be able to help people see that. Take a break. We'll come back. I'll give you another way to respond to this claim that there is no evidence for God's existence.
I've been working with students as a speaker, as a teacher for a long time, but especially as my 3 kids got older, Scotty, Shauna, and Shane. I started thinking, how am I gonna pass on my faith to them? In our increasingly secular culture, how do I do this? So I kind of had a little bit of selfish motivations to help with my own kids and then hopefully pass that wisdom on to others.
I felt like I wasn't doing the job I needed to do to help my young graduates in high school hold on to what is true. And I had some early failures. You know, a lot of those early students did not stay in the faith. And so I learned some things, and we changed course. And the best years of ministry, even, you know, if I look back at children's ministry and lead pastoring, were those years in youth ministry, right? Working with high schoolers. So I just felt like that this is an area that I think I could speak into.
So there's a lot of books that are kind of, you know, why books, or like here's what you should know. But what really motivated me is I didn't see any books that said, here's how you practically actually do this tangibly. Here's some ideas to put into practice.
All the stuff we're talking about, we hope initiates a journey that starts you thinking about how to do this in a different way. But it's in the end going to come down to, are we willing to love our kids enough to prioritize our interests to help teach them a Christian worldview? Okay, in the first response, I'm really leveraging an affirmative case for God's existence from several different lines of evidence. But you may feel like, hey, you know, I don't even know that I can master all of that, and I'm not maybe comfortable making an affirmative case. Maybe there's some other way to do this. Well, there is another way to do this, because I want you to be able and willing to shift the burden of proof. The idea here is that you're making an affirmative claim that God exists, and therefore you alone have the burden of proof. You made the claim, you need to be able to prove that. But the other side that believes there is no God also makes an affirmative claim that they have a burden to prove. So what I would do if someone asked this question, if you're not comfortable making an affirmative case, then simply shift the burden of proof to where it really goes, because the thing started with somebody saying there's no evidence for God's existence. So basically this is the approach I'm trying to take here in this second response to the objection. So I'll put it on the screen for you. Here we go. Okay, so if God didn't create the universe and everything in it, if there's no evidence for God because there's no God, well, then the cosmos, the universe itself, is simply the product of the natural stuff in the cosmos. In other words, if that's the case, then everything we see in the universe is simply a product of physics and chemistry, given the ingredients that are available to us, which are just space, time, and matter. That's it. You got to explain everything with space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. So tell me, what evidence do you have that those features alone, those features, those materials, those forces can produce, say, for example, consciousness? This immaterial thing we experience called consciousness. How do we get that with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? How do we get free agency? Because if all we have is stuff, then you know, I mean, it's like physical dominoes. All we have is physical stuff. Well, then we need something to fall against a domino so the next domino turns over. Because in a physical universe, all you would have is what is called event causation. But we make free choices. How do we get free choices if all we are in is a purely physical, what's known as a deterministic universe? What evidence do you have, for example, that physics and chemistry can produce the information we have in DNA? Is there some example in the history of science or the history of the universe in which information came from physics? Can you show that to me, please? What evidence do you have that those forces you were talking about, the purely natural forces, space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry, can account for the appearance of fine-tuning that's both in the universe and even the appearance of design in biology, the fine-tuning in biological structures? If evidence is important to you, and it sounds like it is, then how can you support your naturalistic explanations for all these features of the universe when there isn't sufficient evidence to support such claims? Now, you see what we're done here is we've simply said, okay, look, if I walk into a crime scene, I've said it before, if I walk into a crime scene and I see a bunch of evidence in the crime scene, and I'm with a partner, and the partner says to me, oh, this is clearly the husband who did this, based on the 10 pieces of evidence I see in the crime scene. And then my other partner says, no, it's going to be the roommate who did this. I think it's the roommate, and he makes a case for the roommate. Look, both of them have a responsibility to make a case. There's features in the crime scene. If you think it's the husband, make the case. If you think it's the roommate, make the case. So we have features of the universe. I think it's God. I could spend some time making that case, but maybe you're not ready to do that. Well, the other person thinks that just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry can account for those things in the universe. Great. You make your case. I think when people realize that they cannot make a case, that they don't have sufficient evidence to even support their own naturalistic views, you have taken a step in the right direction. Because what it comes down to is that these people will constantly, and this happens a lot, people will object to your view as a Christian or as a theist, and they'll say, hey, you've got a God of the gaps attitude, right? You don't have a way to, they think that what we're doing is saying, hey, we can't explain it scientifically, therefore God. Okay, but don't be surprised. The other side has a science of the gaps view. They can't explain it scientifically, therefore it's just space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Really? I do have examples of how to explain information, the kind of information I see in DNA. Intelligent beings with minds communicate this way. So I do actually have an example in the history of the universe and the history of science that I can attribute information to. It's just called intelligence. So my point here is that we want to help people see how short their evidence trail is. There's a sense in which we have the gap mentality, the God of the gaps. But often what you're seeing on the other side is a science of the gaps mentality. Let's at least expose that for people. Make sense? Let's take a break. We'll come back, and what we're going to do in the next session is give you a slightly more nuanced view. We've talked about in the first kind of response, well, what kind of affirmative case could we make for God's existence? Great. In the second kind of response, we're talking about, well, what reasonable challenge could we level against this claim that there is no God? Because if there is no God, there's some kind of cause for the stuff in the universe, but the cause you're suggesting really isn't sufficient given the evidence. So now we've kind of turned the table in the second view. I think that one of the best ways to reach people, though, in Gen Z and millennials and in Gen X, I'm a boomer, is through narrative. It's probably always been the best way to reach people. This is why Jesus constantly told parables in the form of narratives to explain more difficult theological principles. And so what I want to do in the next session is to take a narrative approach, a story that might help people see the reasonable, evidential nature of God's existence. Take a break, come back, and we'll do that.
Jay Warner and Susie Wallace have written 3 kids' books to help children know the truth and defend it in the public square. All 3 books mirror Jay Warner's adult books, chapter by chapter. And best yet, the kids' books are written as fictional stories that will turn your kids into detectives as they solve mysteries and learn about Christianity. There's also an interactive academy website at casemakersacademy.com where your kids can join other cadets and complete their own academy notebook. Each course has free videos, activity sheets, and more. Your young readers can even earn their own junior detective graduation certificates and appear on the Honor Cadet Wall. Be sure to visit casemakersacademy.com to learn more. Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily Case Notes email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. Connect with Cold Case Christianity on social media. Visit the Cold Case Christianity homepage and click the social media icons on the top right toolbar. Jim is active on Facebook and Twitter, posting the best apologetics articles from over 250 Christian blogs around the country. You'll also find links to Jim's Instagram, Pinterest, and Google Plus accounts, along with a link to the Cold Case Christianity YouTube page. Stay connected with Cold Case Christianity and become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, what I want to do here is tell a story in order to answer this in a new way. Now I will tell you that, again, if you're going to tell stories, you need to know what the story is. And you need to have enough depth in the story that your 140, 280 character version of it, your Twitter version of the story, if somebody probes in deeper, can actually can actually see the richness of it. So whenever I hear someone tell a story in which they name someone by name, I'm probably going to search that online, right? And learn more. Maybe I want to just know more so I can follow the journey, or I want to fact check the person who's making the claim. So I think there's two ways to do this. Sometimes we just tell parables and analogies, and we use metaphors to describe this is like this. Let me tell you a story that's kind of like this. I get that, and we often do that. What I want to do here is I want to tell a story, a true story, a real story that actually occurred, that might help them see that, there are other reasonable people just like you who have looked at the evidence for this and have been persuaded. Whatever you think there's no evidence for, they thought the evidence was good enough. So I want to be able to share those stories. And that's what we're going to do in this third response. Take a look at it on your screen. Here we go. I don't know if you knew this or not, but one of the most famous atheists of the last century, certainly probably one of the most famous atheists of the generation in which he lived, was a man named Antony Flew. And I guess as the years go by since he's passed away, that maybe people don't know much about Antony Flew, and probably as the years progress, they're going to know less and less. But this is a guy who once thought just like you, that there wasn't enough evidence. There was no evidence for God's existence. He was a very accomplished atheist writer. He was what's known as an analytic and evidentialist philosopher. And he was somebody who was so well known in his community that he was invited to debates. He debated William Lane Craig, one of the best philosophers on the Christian side. He actually wrote several books defending atheism. His writing, though, is very highly academic. So if you love somebody who is an evidentialist, here's a guy who's an evidentialist, and he's an atheist evidentialist. He understands the nature of evidence, okay? So I get it. You're saying there's no evidence for God. Well, would you trust one of the most respected evidentialist atheists of the last 2 centuries? Because that's what Antony Flew was, okay? And he wrote many books, but in his later years, he discovered something evidentially that shifted his thinking. When he examined the evidence for DNA, he changed his mind. And here's why. He found that at the level of genetic information, that level of information, of detailed, specific, complex information in DNA, simply could not be explained without an intelligent author or an intelligent creator. Now, on the basis of the information in DNA, he changed his mind about the existence of God and wrote a book. And it's kind of an interesting cover. It's like, there is no God with the no scratched out, and there is a God written on top of that, because the subtitle is something like how the most notorious atheist became, changed his mind, or it basically became a believer in God. Now, he didn't become a Christian. He simply moved from his atheism to probably a form of deism, the idea that God is necessary for the universe to exist, and even for biology to display signs of design in information in DNA. And that's as far as he went before he died. But he eventually became a theist. Deism is a form of theism. And he did that on the basis of what? Of evidence. If that form of evidence was good enough for him, given his training, given his stature in the atheist community, given the way in which he was a philosopher as an evidentialist, do you think it might be worthy of your time, of your investigation? I mean, if it's good enough for people who are right in that camp that you find yourself, people who you would say are like you, and maybe even know more or have a more academic view of evidence or a more robust view of evidence as a philosopher. What I love about Antony Flou's story is that it's on the basis of evidence that he changed his mind, number one. And he had specific expertise as an evidentialist philosopher. I think we should be telling his story on occasion, not to suggest that any one expert should be the persuading. I'm just suggesting that he might know something about evidence and maybe you should take a look too. Not that on the basis of his conversion alone, every one of you guys should convert. I think that's silly, right? I think instead what we want to say is, hey, if this is a guy who I respect in this area. Now, what's interesting is that I often, on social media especially, will hear people say, well, Jim, I can't trust you on that because, you don't have this expertise that you would need to have in order to believe this is true or to see this. Yet here's a guy who has all the expertise that you venerated for years as an atheist, who makes the same kind of decision I do. Now, how are we going to kick this guy to the curb? Well, he's not a biologist. Well, do you need biologists who are believers? I got a bunch of those for you. Well, yeah, but you're going to have some excuse at some point. When you've got people who are committed to the discipline, the science, and who are also committed to evidence, and both these folks become believers in God's existence, what more are we looking for here? I think we have to be fair about that. And so all I want to do with this example of Antony Flou is not to say, gotcha, told you so. No. It's to say, well, look, this was at least provoked him to look deeper. Do you think it might provoke you to look deeper? You'd be surprised what you might find. And that's what we want to do, is we want to introduce people to concepts. We want to introduce them to the search, introduce them to the first step. We want to be reasonable. We don't want to be, we want to be fair, and we want to be relatively neutral. We're not going to be accusatory. But Antony Flou is a good object lesson for the rest of us who might not think that smart people could ever become believers. You'd be surprised. There are a lot of smart people who are believers. Hope that helps you to think through these issues and answer this objection in one of these three ways. And we'll see you right back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.